Okay, everyone. Welcome to this discussion about an epic about page-specific CSS. Thanks for Jean for setting this up. I'm just sharing, because this is probably a one-off discussion, I'm just sharing the link to our Frontend Foundation office hours docs because, it's easier to type for all of us into that document, and then we can maybe get a summary of this meeting back into the epic, because collaborating on a comment on an epic seems like pretty not so great experience. Maybe just to sum it up, we have page-specific CSS. This is currently all bundled into application CSS, and Jean has been basically tasked to take care of it, and that we only load this page-specific CSS on individual files, on the individual routes/sites. And there is a work in progress merge request that has been created in the last front-end pairing session in order to be able to load these CSS files via Webpack. Yeah, I hope I summed it up correctly. If not, there are, speak now or hold your peace forever.
Yeah, so as Lucas mentioned, I'm running with this epic, and the objective that I have is...
Do we want to record this meeting? Is there any...
I think we are.
We are recording this meeting.
Okay.
The objective that I have is to get to an optimal approach and have one page converted, which can serve as a reference for how we want to go about extracting out the other pages. And so what I imagine is after kind of like having explored the various options we have, whether it is using Webpack and introducing that to build a CSS, which is the route that we explored in the front-end pairing hours, and Paul and the rest of the team helped to guide that solution. There's also an alternative where we already have, for instance, the XTerm styles that are only included for the terminal, and so it's about evaluating these two options. There are some concerns with the Webpack route, and so if, for instance, the approach we're taking with the XTerm page bundle is appropriate, that might be enough for us to say, right, this is the approach we want to take. My goal is to define the approach and then create issues for each of these pages that we want to split out, and then find allies in the front-end group to help execute on these. Similar to how the Jethidus kind of like conversion happened, and many other things where we create a bunch of issues and we farm it out to engineers who are able to help us out on this. So essentially, that's my only objective, is to find out what is the best approach to take now. It doesn't have to be the most optimal approach. Maybe a Webpack approach is the one we want to take in the future, but it might not be the best approach for right now. And so I'm hoping through this conversation today, we can evaluate the Webpack approach, whether there's value in pursuing that further, or whether the potential challenges we might have is too significant right now. And also evaluating the other approach where we have, for instance, the XTerm page bundle, and seeing whether that is sufficient for what we need in as a first iteration.
Mike, do you want to start, or should I just get lost and start and babble for a long time?
I can start. I think either way, we're probably going to go down some rabbit trails of discussion. A couple thoughts that I don't really have organized, so I'm just going to throw them out there. Right now, we're doing the import pages /*/* thing from application.scss, which means all of these quote-unquote page-specific page-specific CSS are currently being bundled together, which means there could very possibly be a lot of pages that are relying on the existence of CSS selectors and rules from unrelated pages without, you know, realizing and making that dependency explicit. So we can't necessarily just split all these out and expect that it'll work exactly as intended. There might be some issues. It's the same problem when we had, you know, global scope of use in our front end code, because, you know, there were a lot of modules that might rely on another module being included that, you know, there's no explicit import, so it's hard to tell exactly where. But just one concern. So it is, I like the approach of taking it one page at a time and sort of doing this in a, you know, like we're doing with the gist of this project, and making sure that as we split out these page specific styles, that it's not breaking something somewhere else. I do think ultimately Webpack is the best way to go about doing this in the long term, for sure. Right now, we have a few, I think, view components which have styles embedded within them, and because it's a totally different compilation process from our main SCSS, I don't think we can use the same variables and mix-ins across them, which is annoying. Being able to kind of have them all compiled from the same source and being able to share all the variables and mix-ins would be a huge improvement. Yeah, the other concerns with Webpack, the reason we didn't jump in this in the past was because Webpack dev server specifically has a notorious, not even just the dev server, but the Webpack compile process in general has had always been butting up against heap overflow memory issues. And that's just with our JavaScript code. I imagine if we added a lot of SCSS, it could increase the memory requirements and possibly, you know, put us into more issues. It's worth considering the work in progress, or the proof of concept isn't really going to suss out whether we're going to run into memory issues or not. We're really going to have to try compiling all of our CSS in Webpack to find out what the impact is there. I don't think it would be terribly difficult to do this. We could even just start out just compiling the application CSS gigantic monolith bundle as it is exactly now, but just in Webpack, just to see what happens. And I think that'd be a good starting point. I probably have other points that I was floating around in my head, but they're escaping me right now. So I'll let someone else talk for a minute.
Yeah, before I let Lucas talk, I will just mention that in terms of the fact that we have a single bundle and some pages might inadvertently be relying on other styles. In the initial conversation with Tim, I asked if we had something like visual regression testing in place, and he mentioned this GitLab Screener project, which we can set up with a bunch of URLs to essentially give us some guardrails while we're doing this, to at least try and preemptively pick up any page dependencies that might break before we kind of like push it out into production and so on. And hopefully this will help us pick up some issues. It might not be a foolproof solution, but we can definitely mitigate some of the risk of breaking dependencies that pages might have.
That's good, yeah. We've long needed good visual regression testing on GitLab, and it's good to see that we're making progress towards that.
Okay, I mean, to be perfectly honest, if we move stuff and break things, we have an easy way to revert, right? Because we are basically just moving the import of a file. So in case we really, really break something, either we should analyze whether we are able to fix it. Maybe someone else can be typing while I make my points, right? Yes. Yeah, thanks. So regarding the point of the side effects, I mean, ultimately, we want to get rid of the side effects. And obviously moving it out of the application CSS is a first step, because in case something breaks, or maybe sometimes we're even correcting side effects later on, which we then might not need to correct anymore or overcorrect, right? Imagine that like one of the imported pages introduces a side effect, and then follow-up page, fixes that side effect. So it's easily revertible, and we should do it anyhow. And I mean, as an even further step, eventually we should try and tackle these, but try to reduce the page-specific CSS anyway, and see if we could, convert some of the stuff that's in there, right? But it's obviously a second step. As far as I understand it, Sean, the first step is like move that stuff out, right? So my recommendation would be go with the thing that Tim mentions with the page bundled CSS, just because we have it in place already. It might be that it's a bit more manual work, but we don't introduce like a new way to compile SCSS that is its own rabbit hole, because it might handle variables differently. There are actually now 3 different Sas implementations, right? So there is the libruby Sas, there is the, which is using Sas C, there's Node Sas, which is also using the C version. Then there is the Dart version, which is compiled to JavaScript, but we don't know what the memory and performance Webpack impacts are, right? And my fear would be that without proper guidelines around it, and without proper checking, which we won't have from the start, we might run into the problem that people are suddenly using it or utilizing more because it's suddenly there, without having us test it properly, and it will make migrating away or changing the Webpack implementation. So my recommendation would be to go with that assets precompile, because whether you define an assets precompile or whether do you an import FSCSS doesn't really matter, in my opinion, right? Because we basically don't know the side effects of the Webpack stuff. I'm not saying that we cannot explore it in parallel, maybe. But if we decide to go with SCSS here on Webpack, I would say we should only do it if we have the long-term goal of ultimately moving everything to Webpack, right?
I would agree. I think this is kind of an all or nothing thing as far as the transition to Webpack goes. We don't want to just do like some SCSS in Webpack and some with sprockets or some other method. We kind of want to do it all in one place, just to keep things dry and having the configuration be the same. And as Lucas mentioned, there might be some implementation details of the SCSS compiler that we're using. I would assume that they should all be pretty standardized. I can't imagine that there's a huge deviation between them, but I'm not sure. I do think, yeah, we can totally work on these 2 projects in parallel. I think it's a separate question, moving SCSS compilation to Webpack and splitting our SCSS into page-specific bundles are kind of 2 separate things. The only thing that's a cross-cutting consideration is the framework that we build to govern the automatic imports of page-specific CSS, like when the views are rendered by Rails. Is it going to be some magic that we put together with the Webpack manifest where it's going to notice the CSS and include it in line, or is it going to be handled, by Webpack itself through like CSS and JS stuff that I don't know exactly how the extract CSS plugin works, or using sprockets and that method. But I'm trying to imagine, like right now with Webpack, we have this pages directory where we will kind of automatically include Webpack entry point bundles based on your location and the correlation with the source directory. We're thinking about re-implementing this and just using kind of a routed, like a manually defined routing table. And we have to maybe think through how we would handle the CSS in a similar way. So there's a consideration there. I guess the downside to implementing it, splitting out the CSS into page-specific bundles before transitioning to Webpack is we might have to duplicate some effort there as far as coming up with a solution to import the CSS onto the page. We may have like two competing solutions there. Does that make sense? I'm kind of rambling.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But to be honest, like we're not currently, at least, obviously, if we could get a win and suddenly load all SCSS that's page specific automatically, we would be happy, right? But this, at least the plan says, hey, we're going to create individual issues because we might need to do some manual checking. And obviously, looking at the potential side effects is easier if you just go file by file by file. So my question would be like, how much effort is it really? Do we need like an autoloader solution, or could we just make it a gigantic manual switch case statement essentially, right? Paul is actually linking to that stuff here, right? Page bundle.
Yeah. So there's different approaches. We could do the asset config assets precompile line, which, you know, that's going to balloon in size pretty quickly if we start doing one for every page specific bundle. And then there's also the matter of, are those automatically imported on the correct pages, or do you have to add something in the HAML to make sure that that's the style tag gets added?
Yeah, that's
somewhere. It's either going to be automatic, where we have this thing that discovers these compiled CSS files and imports them based on file name schemas like we do with JavaScript, or we do it manually, where on the HAML page we have import style tag, or even in the JavaScript page specific bundle we have an import whatever.scss that handles it. We have to figure out exactly how we want that to work.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, that would basically be a good exploration. I mean, we can, yeah, so the page bundles would have the downside because they're probably imported like in the page specific HAMLs, or like it says like something like, hey, add this CSS to our page somehow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Oof. Yeah, and you basically, just to reiterate, you would say, hey, it could be for that for this we would need to write this stuff probably in Ruby to have some autoloader similar to Webpack, or we would need to define a file to say on which routes which thing is loaded. Yeah.
In my opinion, and this is without having tested anything, so this is just my hunch, but I like the idea of actually importing the CSS within the JavaScript. I like it. We could almost, rather than calling it page-specific CSS, it could kind of be like component-specific CSS. Like, you know, if we need CSS to accompany, well, I mean, in view components, this is explicit. You know, you have a style section that we can use that might tag along with like the modal functionality or something, and maybe that's modal specific CSS. But even for non-view components, we can have a CSS import statement at the top, and you know, maybe it's for like I'm trying to think of something that's used to, like discussions CSS or something like that, and that will go along with like our discussions JavaScript bundle, and then it will just kind of go along to every page where that discussions JavaScript is loaded. This CSS will also be loaded, so we don't have to think through which pages need it. It'll just kind of it'll be portable with it. I don't know. I think that might reduce the overhead of trying to manually figure out where each of these need to go.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, the benefit it has if we are moving it to the JavaScript and we decide to refactor the approach that we're using for JavaScript, we would automatically also have that reconsideration working for the CSS, right? And we're having the benefit, if we're using Webpack, we're having the benefit of utilizing all the Webpack tools. I mean, there are a few considerations that we are having because we had it in the past, is like, you know, imports and stuff of other static assets. I don't know how Sprockets deals with that. But yeah.
What do you mean by, like, can you give an example?
If you have like an image URL or stuff like that, right? Because I assume that Sprockets adjusts paths. Because if you have if you reference like an image in the SCSS, that then Sprockets adjusts the paths to be correct to that assets, let's say like an SVG or an image. I think it's one of the concerns that Simon raised here, like image URL or whatever. And that is Sprocket specific. And I don't know, is Webpack currently already able, if you reference like an image, to pull that in? Like,
yes. Yeah, that'll work exactly the same way. We'll have to make sure that we, you know, convert it correctly when we move it over. I think the syntax might be a little bit different in the way that it works, but yeah, it basically uses the same loader system that we use for if you import an image into a JavaScript file, it'll use the same loaders. So if we have, you know, we have it a little odd the way we've got it set up, because some file types like SVGs we use like raw loader, and it'll take the contents of the file and put it into a variable, whereas other file extension types we use file loader, which turns it into a path, which is just a reference to, like, it exports it as another asset that can be loaded externally. And we need to make sure that those are kind of the way that CSS is expecting these to be. I think that would work for almost all of the. Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to take that one at a time and make sure that we're not breaking anything when we do that.
Yeah.
Okay. But we can even make it kind of smart too, where like if you have an SVG that's, you know, only a couple of bytes or something, or like a placeholder image that's like a 1x1 pixel, instead of creating a reference to a separate file, you can have it just embedded as like a data URL.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, looking at this work in progress merge request, right? I think the interesting thing here would be not to have just a little background color red important. I understand that this came from a hackathon kind of pair programming session, but it would be interesting to actually port one of the files and import it that way. And we could potentially come back to other concerns about external files and so on later. But it would be interesting, and then see what impact this has, and also compare the different Sas implementations, right? Because there is Node Sas, and this MR currently uses the other Sas, which is the new Sas, which is probably the one that we want to go long term, but it's also different already from the stuff that we do on the Ruby side of things, and that also the Node Sas side of things does. And as it's pure JavaScript, it will definitely be slower. So I think in order to analyze the impact using one page that uses a bit more of the features, like, hey, it's going to use some of our variables, hey, it's going to to be like the real deal, it's like maybe one of those 20 kilobyte, maybe one of those, you know, diffs, nodes, pipelines, maybe something that's not as broad as the other ones here. Maybe there's a good one that's like a bit broader, but not too broad, if you know what I mean. Labels, yeah, maybe labels or something. I don't know.
I'd be interested to just try, you know, like in our main.js, import application.scss and just see what happens. I'd be curious, at least to test the memory constraints, you know, whether the compilation process can handle it. And we could compare the output there to what Sprocket's outputs maybe. I don't know. That would be a lot of stuff to comb through at once to make sure that we don't have any regressions, but I'd be interested just to see if it's feasible to move it to Webpack in the long term.
Yeah. Sarah and Sam have made a few points. Are we already at time? Sorry.
Yeah, so I wanted to quickly ask, we've explored what feels like what might be the preferred long-term solution. Yeah. If we were to iterate and go with the page bundles approach, is this something that takes us away from where we might want to go in terms, like, are we iterating in a direction that makes it more difficult for if we wanted to go a Webpack route down the line, or does it have no substantial impact? And so essentially what I'm looking at is, can we confidently say that as a first iteration we can go the page bundles approach, and that it should be feasible for us as a first step without limiting or making things more difficult down the line?
I mean, it would be interesting because you, without Webpack specific considerations, you would already be able to see if you run in these side effect problems, right, that we're concerned about. Because
that'll be a problem whether we do it with Webpack or not. So fixing that.
Exactly. And then moving from this pre-bundle to Webpack should be page bundles to Webpack should be easy, because you just need to remove it from the HAML template again and import it in the correct JS file. It would also have the benefit that you don't have any other sprockets to note Sas specific considerations like the image URLs and stuff. And it would, and it would probably have the benefit, if you look at it, that, you know, just by converting the first 10 or so, you're already at a really like a benefit of removing more than a quarter of the SCSS, right? If you're already tackling the, why am I with tackling? Watching too much soccer. But you probably could already, you know, take 150K away from the other page specific CSS, right?
Yeah. Okay, so it feels like the safe and sensible iteration here is going with the page bundles approach, while at the same time not forgetting about the Webpack approach. It is potentially the longer term solution that we want to explore and might be the ideal, but going page bundles won't restrict that. In fact, it might have the benefit of helping us decouple the page specific CSS so long from each other.
Yeah, and I mean, Mike and I have been discussing a bit. Mike is currently working in this iteration, working on source maps, improving source maps, and he's going to be off until after the weekend, so basically from tomorrow. And we have been discussing what would be a high impact project, and I assume that the CSS thing would be a high impact project that we also can look at. So just by moving ahead with the iteration on the page bundles doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to go wait until the Webpack approach until like 14.0 or something, right? We can make this a priority on the front-end foundation if we want to. Yeah.
Hello, Sarah. would you like to say something as well?
I would like to say two things, actually. One of the short things is in terms of verification, GitLab UI does have visual testing. And while I wouldn't suggest adding it to GitLab proper, setting it up locally might be helpful for people to run things to see if when they're changing files to do verification, if big things are like totally changed. But the second thing that I really did want to say is to spend 2 minutes standing for my personal hobby horse, which is that I think fundamentally using more utility CSS classes will get us to a place where we're loading less CSS, right? Like the actual fundamental solution, as opposed to breaking it up and loading it in different chunks, is to just have less of it. And so I actually am really excited to see this project, because I think by breaking things up by pages, like we make a difference now, but we also make space to make it easier to start converting things over to using utility classes in the future. And I just wanted to sort of mention that to keep that in people's minds, that, right, like if you use utility CSS, you just define the CSS once. So it's inherently smaller than continuously making different classes for different component sections. So just to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think breaking out things from the monolithic application.scss bundle into smaller bits will definitely make it more maintainable in the future. We don't have to suddenly guess, like, where is this selector used in GitLab when we're deciding whether we remove it or not. We'll know if it's in a page specific bundle that it's in this narrow area of GitLab. It's much easier to figure out. I imagine we have a lot of CSS selectors hidden away in here that are probably irrelevant and used nowhere, that we just haven't been able to get rid of because no one knows if it's used nowhere. We have to test everything, and everyone's afraid because we don't have visual regression testing in GitLab, and that should be a big epic that we should all be working on, as well as just doing something along those lines. I like the project that you pointed out earlier, Gene. I hadn't seen that before, the GitLab screener. Is that something that we're looking to start doing automated visual regression testing on, or is this kind of just a proof of concept that Tim threw together? It looks like the latest update was a year ago, so.
Yeah, my understanding is that it was more of a proof of concept rather than a specific, like something to be used locally, rather than something integrated into the CI, because there's some challenges with running visual regression tests in the CI environment itself as well. Previously, I used an external tool that we kind of like integrated with as part of our CI pipeline, which helped a lot, specifically when you refactor things to catch regressions. So I think there's value in adding it. I think for this specific iteration, just being able to run something locally and to have an initial feedback and some confidence that you can run it before you make the change, and then after you make the change, and just comparing that and having some initial kind of like confirmation that you haven't drastically changed something is really valuable and definitely needed as part of this process of breaking out the page specific CSS.
I feel like we're really close to being able to do something like that in GitLab, and I'm sorry, this is kind of a digression off the main purpose of this this topic, but like we use the capybara tests in our spec, and they already generate image snapshots when there's like a test failure. The only thing preventing those from being deterministic, every time that you generate a snapshot, is the database differences. If you retry a test, it'll maybe generate a random slug for the project that you're on, or it might generate some lorem ipsum text that might be different in each iteration. So that would trip up things when trying to do a visual regression test, because it might look like something changed when it really didn't. But I think that's a solvable problem. If we just make those database feeds deterministic, we can run the same test multiple times and then just check the visual output against what happened last time.
One quick question, because the CSS is, we don't have as much CSS files and dynamic loading and whatnot. would it be feasible to generate the CSS in sprockets twice? Like once like basically have a feature flag for, hey, use the CSS, and hey, use the CSS that has already like 5-page bundles removed?
So we'd compile it both ways and then run a test with both options. Yeah,
not necessarily a test, but then we could also just turn it on production once it's deployed to production. Be like, hey, this feature flag, and if we don't get any weird issues in the is this known channel within a week, we can be like, eh. I mean, to be honest, like if we have side effects there and other pages are relying on those side effects, those pages have been broken from the start, kind of, right?
Yeah, there shouldn't be side effects because people shouldn't have been relying on CSS selectors to work on pages that aren't the pages that, but I mean, in practice, no one really checks those things. Yeah, and like I said, I'm having PTSD flashbacks to when we converted to Webpack the first time, and everything was imported in one gigantic application.js bundle, and there is a lot of code that was kind of having these implicit reliance on some other module that had to have been imported before this one, and it was a nightmare trying to cut through that Gordian knot of dependencies that were not explicit. I imagine this is going to be similar. But yeah, I like the idea of just having it be a feature flag. You know, it can just be like, you know, GitLab Next. You can toggle between the two and see if something breaks pretty easily, and it would only be visible to, you know, GitLab employees or something. So,
I mean, we should at least explore it, because that thing of, hey, you decide like which because this I think the sprockets compilation is not that bad. Like it's not like compiling all of our JavaScript with all the optimizations twice. It's just like, hey, let's compile this little tiny bit of not tiny bit, but let's compile the CSS twice, which is probably not that expensive, right? We should at least explore it. Anyway,
the advantage of using a feature flag too is that it solves the problem of getting things to render. That a lot of times, especially depending on what stage you're working on, like even getting the data to test it, if you want people to visually test it, can be a pain. So I think that's like another good reason to like let everybody's eyes find the broken CSS and sort of run it that way. Seems like a really good approach.
Yeah. And I mean, we could also just enable it for the GitLab org group. So in the worst case, we break our projects and don't necessarily break the projects of customers and so on, right?
I wonder, could we use a tool to automate this? Like, we don't even need to look for visual regression changes. Like, we could look in the Chrome developer tools I know they have the code coverage tab for JavaScript where it tells you which bits of JavaScript were actually executed on the page. Does it have something similar for CSS where it tells you which selectors are actually utilized on the page?
It has exactly that, but the problem is that you're not visiting all the pages, right?
Right.
I mean,
I'm just thinking like if we had the same page open in two places in the exact same state, and you could run this and just see like, are there any selectors that exist in this one that aren't in this one, and then we can start debugging from there.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It would be so cool if Puppeteer could like access the console for you. So if we could like automate it by running Puppeteer and then going into the console and running the Chrome thing and seeing what it output.
I think Selenium can do that, right? I don't know enough about.
I don't know if the headless browsers have these coverage tools, if they have access to that, right?
It'd be interesting to check out. How does Purge CSS work? It must use a similar kind of thing, right?
You give it a list of selectors probably, and that list is compiled from somewhere, and then it compares it.
Yeah. But if what that does, and I'm not super familiar with Purge CSS, but I assume it just takes all of your selectors, looks on the page for which ones are unused, takes them out, and then gives you this output. And if we do that on both versions of the compilation and compare the output, it should be identical if we're not missing anything, right?
The big problem with these automatic things based on a code base, you could have a selector that is a side effect but doesn't matter, right? You could have Yeah, because you could be on a page and you have that side effect, but then actually a later thing overrides that thing, and either both are unnecessary on that page, or it could be, hey, I'm setting some completely different margin and
right.
something.
And of course, there are going to be lots of edge cases, and it could be that like the page is not even in the state that uses this selector. Maybe there's a pop-up that comes up that then that selector is utilized, but it's not right now. There could be a lot of false positives, but I mean, it would give us a basis to start with, I think, at least. I wouldn't rely on it exclusively, but
I mean, in the end, if there are still, false positives, false negatives, however, I'll mix it up now and I hadn't had dinner. But if I think we should just use the cheapest resource we have, and that's like 1,200 employees using GitLab every day, right?
yeah.
It's like, those people are also more diligent than robots, right? Because it's like, hey, there was a margin. I love that margin. I want that margin back. Yeah. Anyway, we are 15 minutes over time. I just maybe want to take 5 minutes to Jean, from this discussion, and as you have been basically the initiator, what would you like us to see doing as next steps? How can we support you with this thing? Yeah.
So for me, a couple of things that came out was, we want to explore the Webpack route, but it's not our best next iteration step. The next iteration step should be to go down the page bundles route. There's benefits of doing that already that will help with the Webpack route down the line. So that for me is first decision made, is we're going to go with page bundles. The second thing is having how do we check for the regressions? So instead, so one thing is we can rely on the 1,300 pairs of eyes at GitLab to pick things up and shout loudly, and we can be responsive to that. The other part is to potentially utilize the GitLab Screener project, for instance, that Tim started, to, at least in a development environment, give whoever's trying to separate that page out, give them some confidence. So that's a consideration that I think is fun. I think for me, then, is there any concerns with, if we look at how Xterm, and I think the Web IDE page bundle was done and included, is there any concerns with just mimicking that approach and taking another page and trying it that way? Is there something we need to be aware of that we, apart from copy, like simplistically in my mind, is copy the approach that was done there and try it on one of these pages, like projects or whatever, and see what happens. But if we do 10, 20 of those, is there something we should be considering?
I mean, you'll want to make sure that whatever HAML tag is used to import the CSS is included on all the places it needs to be. Like, for instance, I can't remember what was at the top of the list. I think it was like projects.scss or whatever. You have to suss out exactly what that's referring to. Is that every project /whatever page? And how do we ensure that tag ends up on all the right pages? I don't know if there's like a master like HAML layout that's governing all of these pages that you can just put it in one place, but you might have to put it in several places. Yeah, I don't know.
One crazy idea again. We have on each data tag, we have the Rails route, right? We have this projects, issues, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
What if we start wrapping the page specific CSS in like data, in these selectors, like data equals like body data equals projects, foobar, issues, whatever, right? If we start wrapping them in those before we split them out. I don't know. I've seen that we actually done this in a few places already, but that would, and
Yeah, and I think that would be the easiest solution, is to just, yeah, base it on the Rails route. And you can do that. You can model that after how we're doing it with Webpack. We're reading the manifest, parsing out the controller and the action that we're on, and going that way. Right now, then that would mean you put this import into app/views/layouts/head.html.haml. That's where we import all the Webpack controller bundle tags. And right below that, you can just say, something like, I don't know, if controller matches, projects or something like that, then import this CSS file.
No, I'm not talking about imports right now. I'm talking as a first iteration that we, for example, that we basically go into those existing files and wrap the whole SCSS that is in that file with something like that.
Could try that. Can you match like just the beginning of a string? Because we need to make it work for, data equals projects / like star, whatever. It'd have to be like a wildcard or something.
There is exact matches. There's also contains, right? There's also starts with and ends with. So you could be like, hey, every subpage of groups, every sub-route of groups. And maybe that would give us a way for checking the side effects. But I think Jean doesn't really care about checking the side effects first. You care about getting it out of the page bundle as quickly as possible, right? Right.
Yeah. So getting the first one done, for me is the important thing, because that unlocks me to go and reach out and get help from people. I'm cheekily looking at the the list of files, and I see there's a pipeline.scss one, and I see Sarah is in Verify, and I'm wondering, Sarah, whether you'd be keen on piloting removal of the pipelines one into its own bundle.
Maybe. I can give you a strong maybe on that. I think that's actually a terrifying file, but I don't have to do anything with the file other than move it. And the CSS is already broken, so there's that.
I will take a strong maybe. That's much better than the empty hands I sit with in front of my computer. Like, a lot of this conversation was like over my head. So I'm here to drive the process, and I'm looking for partners on the journey. And if you can give me a maybe, I can work with that.
See, for just
I'm sure I can twist Lucas's arm as well to give me a tentative maybe. And so your maybe and his tentative maybe gives me a strong or at least a weak okay for us to proceed with one of those as an example.
I mean, it's sad that Sam is not on the call anymore, because Sam is now the interim manager for Verify, right? So you could have gotten his strong maybe as well for commitment.
Well, you know what? I'll schedule a coffee chat with Sam right now.
Yeah.
Well,
so
anyway, from my side, thank you very much. This has really been helpful in giving me some clear direction as to what is the actionable next steps. And thank you for volunteering, Sarah and Lucas, to helping me, and for Sam in your absence. I appreciate it. And I think what I'll do is I'll start by creating an issue for the pipeline SCSS one. I'll summarize kind of like our top level thoughts here, and we can iterate on that. We can work on it, and if it takes us a week or whatever or two to get there, that's okay. It's like, we should get this right before we kind of like go out and farm out the work to the rest of the front end group, and do make sure that we, while we can rely on those 1,300 pairs, it can get quite noisy and stressful if they all start shouting at you. I know from personal experience with the handbook, as soon as something is not right there, there's a lot of of opinions coming out. So yeah, so I think let's do this. I'm confident after this conversation. I think I'm confident in the approach we should take, which is really what I wanted to get out of this conversation. So thank you very much. Awesome.
Cool.
Have a good day further, everybody.
Goodbye.
Catch you later.